very happy and very honored to introduce our next episode of the Utopias podcast. This is an episode with the famous and very interesting progressive economist Richard Wolff. Some people call him Rick Wolff. Dr. Wolff is a very interesting figure. He's a professor of economics emeritus from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, visiting professor in the graduate program of International Affairs at the New School in New York City, and the co-founder of Democracy at Work, which is a nonprofit media company that provides readers and listeners with information about economic systems that are not just rooted in capitalism, but even thinking beyond, the current state we're occupying in relation to technology and capitalism, and what some may say is, no longer capitalism, something that might be even more feudal. Richard Wolff is also the host of a nationally syndicated show that's quite excellent that I've joined called Economic Update. And so this is a really great conversation that Dr. Wolff and I have. He's a very kind of well-known public figure around the state of the United States. Where this is something we're looking at as we speak, as we were recording this, with respect to the Iran war, and really what is going to occur with global futures with the G7 countries relative to the BRICS countries. BRICS are countries that include Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and more. Are BRICS emerging countries going to introduce new challenges for the G7 or the biggest 7 nations in the world? What is AI going to mean in relation to all of this? And how can we try to figure out ways to shift or transform or make more resilient our economic system so that workers, consumers, and the wider planet benefit as well as, the business world and now the massive corporate world. And so this is a very, very engaged conversation that I have had with Dr. Wolff that I'm very grateful for. This was recorded in June of 2025, but we thought it was the perfect time to put it out now as we release this episode. So everybody, please enjoy this. Our guest today on Utopia is the fantastic public-facing economist and scholar and public figure, Richard Wolff. Thank you all for joining us. Please, again, rate, review, subscribe, and share this far and wide. We're a non-commercial labor of love. Thank you. So, Dr. Wolff, I'm so grateful for your time and your presence, and thank you for joining the Utopias podcast today.
My pleasure. I'm glad to do it and learn more about you and your work.
Thank you, Dr. Wolff. So, look, we're just sitting. Let's just get rolling with what's right in front of our eyes. We are seeing a sort of level of big money in politics to an extent that we've never seen before in the United States. There's common conversations about the triumph of what's called oligarchy. A lot of this seems to be tied to tech oligarchy, since so much money is flowing through tech. The S&P 500 is dominated by tech. And now there's a great deal of disillusionment, and a lot of disillusionment tied also with the Democratic Party, the kind of sidelining of Senator Sanders. And we're all sitting through a second Trump administration that feels more authoritarian than ever as well. So I want to just start by getting your thoughts on the current situation we're living in the United States, and any thoughts you have on the global repercussions of this situation.
Okay, I'm glad to do that and give you the benefit of having spent my entire adult life trying to understand the capitalist system in which I was born. I was born in Youngstown, Ohio, a place that was thriving at the time I was born, that was the center of the steel industry. My father worked in the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, one of the major factories at that time. He pushed a wheelbarrow with ingots around, but that may leave a misleading impression. He was a refugee from Europe. He was born and raised on the border between France and Germany. My mother was born in Berlin. I have spoken French and German all my life. I speak them now. But I was born when they became American and they had to run for their lives. And settled thanks to the American Friends Service Committee in Ohio. And so I'm born and raised in the Midwest of the United States, and I've worked and lived here all my life. I went to the elite schools, Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. I'm a product of that whole part of this culture. And during that time, my teachers, some of whom were very good, some of whom were very bad, and most of whom were somewhere in the middle, they tried very hard to persuade me that capitalism is the best system since sliced bread, maybe better. And they made a good effort. I listened carefully. I had been brought up to be very respectful of a teacher, any teacher. But they didn't succeed. They did not persuade me. When I asked questions, they could not or would not answer. I never knew quite which. It was the Cold War, so the fear of appearing to be sympathetic to a critique of capitalism was more than many of them could tolerate. Over time, my sense that this system is not only not the best thing, but something we need to do better than, uh, solidified. And so I'm more that now than I was then. So I'm just putting my cards on the table so you know that I'm coming from a critical perspective.
Great.
So, having said that, here's my take. The United States replaced Britain by having an empire even more global and more coordinated than the British ever had. From being a small, unimportant corner of the British Empire, the United States replaced the British Empire and reversed the role so that Britain is now a small, unimportant corner of the American empire, even though for the British it's still too difficult to admit it. As with every other empire, it is very difficult once the empire stops growing and expanding, peaks, and then begins to decline. So, my first comment to you about where things are is that the United States is now a declining empire, and it cannot, at least not yet, face that fact. If you look at the election in last November, none of the three candidates, Trump, Biden, Harris, ever said one word about a declining empire. It is a taboo. It cannot be spoken, it cannot be admitted. And because I went to the schools I went to, I know personally a good number of people in Washington who work at the highest levels of this society. And I can assure you, they cannot face what I just said, even to the point of making an argument with me. So let me be very brief. The United States lost the war in Vietnam. The Communist Party of Vietnam is in charge of that society. That was the enemy. They won, we lost. In Afghanistan, it was the Taliban. They won, we lost. In Iraq, if you look at the Shiite and the Sunni communities, they won with all their troubles with one another. The United States lost. And in the Ukraine, right now, it's crystal clear everywhere, but in the United States, that war is lost. The Russians won, the Ukrainians, and more accurately, the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Americans lost. That should have been enough to signal, uh-oh, something is not working real well, especially when you remember that the United States has the world's greatest military and is one of the world's richest societies. And in every one of those cases I gave you, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Ukraine, you're talking about people that are countries mostly bunched at the lowest end of the scale with no effective military and absolutely no relevant wealth in terms of what exists in the world. So we lost being rich and powerful to countries that were not rich and not powerful. Extraordinary. Number one. Now, number two. At the end of World War II, the American empire, already in existence as a result of World War I, really came into its own. All the other conceivable competitors for dominance in the world had been destroyed by the war. Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, none of them could even function, let alone be a global power. The only country to come out of World War II in much better shape economically than it went into the war was the United States, because the war here offset the Great Depression of the 1930s. We took half the millions that were unemployed and put them in a uniform, and we took the other half of the unemployed and put them to work in the factories making the uniforms and the guns and everything else. We came out of the war in much better shape. All the competitors in much worse shape. That allowed for a kind of dominance that was unmatched, unprecedented in human history, at least as far as I can read it. Certainly modern human history of the world. And just to give you some markers, the United States, which had about 5% of the world's people, accounted in those years after 45, for 30, 40, 50% of world output, 30, 40% of world trade. The US dollar became the global currency. Of course it did. And on and on and on. Anyone with even a smattering of understanding of human history would have known that an empire on that scale, with that dominance, could not be sustained. I mean, that's so anomalous a situation in human history that it really wasn't a question from the beginning of whether this would decline. It really was only a question of when. But
Right.
that is not understood. It was not understood then. Over the second half of the 20th century, the United States operated its empire, repressed efforts to overcome it one way or another. When the British Empire finally was thrown out, whether it was in India or Africa or Asia, the Americans moved in. They showed the people, it took 50 years, but they showed the people that political independence and economic independence are very different things. You can get the former without getting the latter. And that was true for every one of them except China.
Mm.
And that was because China had the good luck to be excluded from the rest of the world after its revolution in 1949. So today, what do we have? We have, and again, I'm jumping over a lot, and I'd be glad to talk about it if you wish.
Sure.
We now have the peak, I would say, around 2010, 2015, and now a good number of years into what will be a long, painful, difficult decline. But already some things are clear, and some are amazingly clear for so short a period. First, and most important, for the first time in a century, the United States has a serious, powerful economic competitor. The Soviet Union never was anything remotely like that. Yes, it had nuclear weapons. Yes, it had a political opposition. But economically, it was simply too poor, too small, and too weak relative to the West. That it survived at all is the miracle. If you look at the statistics and you look at the over, none of that is true with China.
Mm.
China is a much bigger and powerful economy than the Soviet Union ever was, much bigger and more powerful than Russia today is, and there is no prospect of that changing very soon. For each of the last 30 years, the GDP of China has grown 2 to 3 times faster every year
Mm.
than the GDP of the United States.
Wow. Okay.
In 2025, the year we're in, according to data released last week by the OECD, economic growth in the GDP of the United States this year will be 1.9%, and in China, it'll be 4.5%. In other words, even when there's a slowing down of global growth, caused in large part by Mr. Trump's tariff and trade wars, even then, the disparity between China and the United States is maintained. This is not a sustainable arrangement for the United States. And starting with the Obama administration, it understood this and committed itself to a policy which history teaches never works, namely the effort to slow or stop or reverse the technological growth of a competitor. Britain couldn't stop the U.S. and Western Europe can't stop the Eastern Europe, and we can't stop the Chinese. But that's the policy, since it has the wonderful benefit of being able to blame the Chinese for all of this, when in fact a huge assist to the Chinese was given by American industry and Western European capitalist industry, who went to China over the last 30, 40 years, invested an enormous amount of money, took advantage of low wages and an exploding market, and in exchange shared its technology. No one put a gun to their head. They did it in the search for profit. And indeed, it is the search for profit, the profit as the bottom line, profit as the ultimate motivator, that is, if you want one, at the root of the end of the American empire, which we are living through. Perhaps the most important thing that China did was to understand and anticipate what the United States would do. They understood it better than Americans, myself included, understood it.
Mm.
And they took several steps to deal with it. And again, we can talk about the detail, but the most important one is to develop a serious economic alliance with other countries who could help them cope with what they foresaw as the American effort to stifle, to stop, to slow their development. We
Right.
all know that now as the BRICS. And that is a very, very important institution now. It goes a long way to explain why Russia is winning the war in Ukraine. It explains why the United States misjudged Russia's ability to fight that war and therefore lost it, etc., etc. But it also gives evidence of the decline of the United States that we are living through. Being an economist, I add up GDP. GDP is, a rough measure, very rough, of the total output of goods and services in a country in one calendar year. So we use it a lot in economics, and I'm going to use it now. The United States and its major allies, known as the G7, that's the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, and Japan, the G7, together produce about 28% of total GDP on this planet. China and its BRICS allies together produce about 35%.
Uh-huh.
It's
Mm.
important to understand that the world economy has forever changed. What it was in the second half of the 20th century, with the United States sitting on top, which it did, and which has to be understood, is over. The gap between the two, they crossed, by the way, in the year 2020, when they were roughly equal. And ever since, China and the BRICS are growing faster than the United States and the G7. That will continue this year, next year, into the foreseeable future. It means that every global South economy, Britain, excuse me, uh, Africa, Asia, Latin America, when they now need to get investment, when they need trade, when they need to develop their health system, when they need to build a railroad, whatever it is, they still send their delegations to New York and London, etc. But as soon as they're done in New York and London, they go to Beijing, New Delhi, and Sao Paulo, and they go with whoever gives them the better deal. That ability to bargain in that way, which every country is now doing, is paralleled by every corporation in the world, American, non American, having to now rethink its strategy because it's dealing with a different world economy. And therefore, everything that we were used to is coming apart. It's not just what you see in Washington. It is true that in Washington you see a level of desperation that you must take into account, or else you will not understand what they are doing. Most of what they are doing is the result of their desperation about their situation. It's not the cold, developed plan of a secure mastermind. I mean, none of that. That was the way they did it back in the 1970s and 80s. All that's gone. And the only other part of the world that looks like that is Western Europe, which is also totally desperate. The difference there is they have very unpopular governments. Starmer in England, Macron in France, Merz in Germany are people whose popularity is in the low double digits. It's in the teens. The vast majority of the people in those societies, because I follow all of that, hate them. Actually, Mr. Trump is in better shape here than they are there, but they are desperate also. And for good reason, since Mr. Trump is throwing them under the bus as he deals with the desperation he feels. And they don't know quite what to do, and they're in a total mess. But everybody is readjusting. And in that situation, the United States cannot go on. The dollar is becoming less and less secure. A week ago, the third of the three great credit rating agencies here in America, Standard and Poor, Fitch, and Moody. The third one, Moody, followed the other two who had earlier lowered the credit rating. You cannot keep borrowing money at the scale now in the trillions of dollars per year that the US does because the lenders are no longer confident in lending to the United States. And without borrowing, it can't function since it has long ago given up taxing the population to pay for what the government does. It can't do that, so it borrows. But it has now run out of the borrowing, and so it is desperate. So whether you look at economics or you look at the military record, this is a society undergoing economic decline. That economic decline was most painful so far to the white working class in the manufacturing sectors of this country. Those were the workers best paid. Those were the workers most unionized. Those were the workers who earned enough to keep being male, to keep a wife at home, taking care of the children, and all of that. Over the last 40 years, three things destroyed that working class. Automation, they were replaced by your field. First by the computer, then by the robotics, now by AI. Number two, their jobs were relocated to Asia, elsewhere, where the wages were lower and the market was growing. And number three, they were replaced by cheap immigrants, both at the high tech level, HB1 people, and the mass of Central Americans and Africans who work mostly at the bottom of the economic pyramid. They lost their jobs, they lost their income, they lost their social situation. They became more and more angry. They turned to the Democratic Party, which did exactly nothing for them. In fact, was in bed with the same, Peter Thiel and all of those people, as were the Republicans. So they got nothing from them, and they were simply waiting for Mr. Trump. And Mr. Trump figured something out. He figured out that they were very angry and they had nowhere to turn. And he could speak to them if he could make himself appear to be what they needed. And he did that as follows. He took the fact that at the same time that this part of the working class was being savaged economically, there was a movement among black and brown Americans and among women Americans, one for civil rights and all of that, and the other one, the Me Too movement, fighting against their subordination in this culture. And so he did a very clever thing. He said to the white workers, the government is your enemy. It is helping black and brown people, not you. It is helping women, not you. It is them that the Democratic Party serves. It's even them that the old established Republicans, like Bush, serve. You need somebody new and different who is going to smash black and brown people, not help them. Smash the position of women, not help them. And instead, put you, the savaged American white male working class, in the forefront. You're going to be our priority. We're going to use tariffs to bring the jobs back for you. And we are going to smite the diversity, equality, inclusion, everything. We're going to shit all over Harvard, all of that. Just what you've always wanted. We're going to put on a symbolic spectacle that will be all the more powerful because it has to hide the fact that we neither can nor will do anything about your economic dilemma. That's where we sit.
Very, very powerful, and at least three major phenomenon that undergird what you're sharing. Youngest generation in the United States first to make less than its parents, even if you control for inflation, which is quite high, as we all know. Declining life expectancy in the United States and in the UK, again for the first time in American history, looking across generations. The decoupling of the GDP from the S&P 500, which is something we saw during the pandemic with the S&P 500, of course, as we were all on our digital devices to communicate with one another because of the so-called social distancing, Zoom and other, obviously, all big tech booms. That's the S&P 500. GDP is at a local minima, from a macroeconomic perspective, and now we have sort of this Trump back in power, kind of alluding to the Gilded Age, right? An era in the late 1800s about where sort of like land grabs and conquest, and so all these sort of everything from Greenland to the Panama Canal to Canada as the 51st state. So we see a lot of that sort of turn back the clock. We can get back to it, but staring at us all in the face is the question of where and how can or should both our economy in the United States, and we can also say global economies, change and adapt to support us all. And then I think the other very tied question of what we can or should do to try to restore or fight for our democracy. And all of that, particularly given the ways in which Senator Sanders, both in 2016 and 2020, was essentially shushed or shunned by the Democratic Party. So we're standing at these, looking at all of this right now. What are your thoughts, Dr. Wolff, on both on what we can do to restore a fair and dignified economy so that people feel economically secure, and try to get our democracy back at work, right? The name of your organization, Democracy at Work.
Yes, well, it's always difficult to answer those kinds of questions because they presuppose something that isn't established. Now, here's what I mean. It is very tempting to get angry at Mr. Trump for constricting democratic expression. He's doing that. He will continue to do that. He believes in all of that. Likewise, it is difficult to get people to fight for a different economic system on the grounds that it is a necessary part of making society better in all the ways you just did. And the reason is, frustrating as my answer may be, the reason is that in this culture that I've lived and worked in, and I've always been happy to do so, the level, first, of what you might call economic literacy, but secondly, the level of honest critical thinking is so abysmally low that having these conversations becomes an exercise in futility. And the last thing I want is for that to be a reason for people then not to do it or not to struggle. And that's not what I'm after. What I'm after is to have an understanding that we are behind as a nation. We don't think systemically about capitalism. The very pride taken in this country, justifiably, that we question the education system and we question the transportation system and we question marriage, we question extraordinary, we question. And it's good, we do. When it comes to the economic system, no question. There is no question. There is no conversation. During the time of the Soviet Union, the second half of the 20th century, economics departments across American universities typically would have one or two courses that were called comparative economic systems. They were I occasionally taught these things. They were usually childish. They were usually taught by people who didn't know very much, but knew enough to celebrate capitalism and denounce socialism and communism, which seemed to be what the course was about. And they didn't do that very well because the level of ignorance, even for them in the population, was so total that you would have to take half a semester just to describe the Soviet economy because they had no idea what goes on there, other than some fanciful derivative of a mediocre TV program portraying them in the worst conceivable light one could shine on them. Uh, I'm going to exaggerate now. I don't think that's changed all that much. I'll give you a couple of examples. When I give talks, I often make sure to come to a point where I say something like the following: that my father was born in France, and so I keep up with France as a culture and so forth. And that in France there's been a law on the books for many decades. Now, when you graduate from college or high school and you take your first job, you are informed, because the law requires it, you are informed that under French law, your employer must give you 5 weeks of paid vacation every year. I wish I could have a camera mounted right next to me, just panning across the audience as they try. They're young people, they're honest, they're trying to take in what I, the authority figure standing on the podium, have just told them. About half of them get it. The other half don't. They will, 2 days later, speak to me. They will have never gotten that, or they got it and they forgot it. They can't go there. They can't. They can't. When I tell them that Europe does not allow the death penalty, they look at me. They don't know what to do with that. I tell them that to go to the university in Germany costs you, in terms of tuition and fees, nothing. You have to pay room and board, but there are no fees. And that many countries in Europe do this. And that you can go to the German university, even if you're not a German. Anybody, anywhere, any nationality can go to Germany and enroll without paying and get a degree, which, when compared to the American BA, is at least as good. I'm being polite. Okay. They they have no idea. When I say the word capitalism, I see it again. They don't have any idea what that means. And it's not just my students. The New York Times writes the capitalist system, free markets, private enterprise. Well, I'm an economic historian. I know that slavery is full of free markets and private enterprise. And so is feudalism. And so it's not a distinguishing characteristics of to distinguish capitalism. It's as if I said an American is distinguished by the fact that he has a nose. Uh, that won't do. He does have a nose. That you got it. But that won't help you distinguish an American from an Ethiopian or from a Nigerian or anybody else. When you're at that level, you reach the following conclusion, which is why I do what I do. My job is to, in every way I know how, cope with, respond to, get beyond the level of economic illiteracy in a way that I think someone like me, maybe several centuries ago, had to overcome illiteracy literally. People who didn't know how to read, and in order to communicate, had to help them read, and that became something useful. And if I've had any success, and I have 500,000 YouTube followers, it is because that's what I do. I analyze the economic system by a narrative that they can understand, that pulls together the different essentials and develops a story they can go back to, into which they can insert their own lived experience, into which they can insert the bits and pieces they've gotten from other sources, and come up with a coherent view about what's going on that can give them confidence in taking action, because they can see the relationship between the action they're drawn into and the narrative they can tell and the change they want to see. You have to have that, otherwise the mass of people who are with you won't act with you. They'll be with you, but they won't act with you. And we have in the United States, in my judgment, a very big left. We don't have an organized left, and we don't have an adequately active left. But in terms of a consciousness, it's there, but it lacks the clarity, the narrative, the literacy in which, without which it will not become active. That's my concern. And so what democracy at work is, just to take it the next step, we are largely an educational effort. We produce books. We produce a weekly radio and television show that's been going for 15 years. We produce a vast number of videos, long, short form, all the rest. We have a very active social media program, and it's all about explaining, analyzing what's going on in a language people can understand and then hopefully use to make that transition from a vague feeling that something is not right to an understanding that leads to a realization that there can be action in this situation. And I don't prescribe what action. I don't know what the best way is. I don't even think there is one. I think I have to motivate and get people active. They will find the roots of action, the best
Mm,
ways.
mm, mm.
I don't want to prescribe it. I don't know it. It would be dishonest of me to push them in one direction or another. I wish there were a political party into which I could steer people, but there isn't. And, that's part of the problem. There is the Democratic Party is hopeless, in my judgment. It's been hopeless for a long time. If anything, it's more hopeless now. The little bit that Bernie could have done, and I've worked with Bernie a little bit over the years, um, or the little bit now that Ocasio Cortez might be able to do,
Right.
it's still very little, very disorganized, disconnected from a large part of what has to be the constituency. And so it makes, and they don't seem to get it, or if they do, I'm not seeing the steps I would like to see to overcome that. I'm very grateful they're there. You'll never hear a word of critique from them except inside our own circles, where, to be clear, what's missing from them has to be made but not publicly, and not in any way that would weaken the little bit of a position. Look,
Yeah.
look, the country is changing. I did this morning. We're in the middle of elections here in New York City. I'm sitting in New York City, in Manhattan, and we're about to vote. And the interesting thing about this vote, which goes from the mayor of the city of New York down to the city council and so forth, is there's a smattering of people who have on their literature, I am a socialist. I am running for office. Please vote for me. This is very, granted, what they mean by socialism is all over the lot. I got it. But this is nonetheless very, it's like Bernie being able to say, I'm not going to run away from that label was an enormous contribution, which is part of the reason I would never criticize him, because I'm grateful to all that we owe him for what he's done, and a little bit Ocasio as well. But I've been voting for a socialist for mayor, who, by the way, has a chance, believe it or
Yep.
not.
Zoran. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, he's coming in second. Uh, Only Mr. Cuomo's money stands in the way, although that's formidable as a problem. The right wing, the Republicans, are already attacking him for being a socialist. That's it. But the Republicans don't count here. So it's all in the Democratic Party. But I'm voting for, I've had on my radio show a state senator from here, a woman named Gonzalez, very happy to be identified with me, very happy to be socialist public. I asked her on the air, are you, is this a cost for you? Oh no, people like it. Wonderful. I want, so there are things that we can build on. And I got to tell you, I've done this all by the seat of my pants. I retired from being a full time professor. I'm now a visiting professor, so I have mostly my time.
Right.
But having tried to develop a public program, it's taken us 15 years, but we did it. We have 500,000 YouTube subscribers. We have an active Facebook, Twitter, X, Substack. I mean, you name it, we do it.
You know what you're also reminding me of. It's a very powerful point that to remind me and remind our listeners that economic anxiety and economic insecurity is maybe there, but understanding of what the conditions are or what the forces are that have led to these to the to this situation, it may not be there for most people. So they need to understand the forces that have extracted wealth, value, and actually democratic power. Because as we know, our mutual colleague Amartya Sen, for example, elderly gentleman, I was a student, but has pointed out persuasively that democracies and economic security have to work with one another, or that they're twins in a sense.
Absolutely. I mean, they for me, the goal of everything is to have a population that through the efforts you make, the efforts we make, and that of all the others trying to deal with this, begin to understand the world differently. I am very impressed. I have to say it in all honesty. I am very impressed at how the business community of the United States reacted to the Great Depression, which was for them a trauma, a double trauma. First, the trauma that their vaunted capitalist system collapsed on them.
Yep.
Totally. Just, you know, 25% unemployment in 1933. End of conversation, right? And then the worst, that the labor movement, together with two socialist parties and the Communist Party, mobilized the working class in the Depression to demand a left wing lurch on the part of the government, creating Social Security, unemployment compensation, the first minimum wage, 15 million people hired on federal jobs. When I tell people the American history, they don't know, of course, anything. That all had to be expunged.
Yeah.
And then when you explain to them the reason it had to be expunged after the war is because the payment for the Social Security and the unemployment compensation and the wages of the 15 million public employees was taken from the ruling class. They had to pay much higher taxes and they had to lend what they didn't pay in taxes to the government to help the average person. They were outraged every way. And all of American history leading to that point explains why they were outraged. Something was being done that didn't go with this country as they understood it. They were right.
Right.
After the war, having been traumatized by the collapse, traumatized by having to pay for the solution to the collapse, they were determined to get rid of whatever made all that possible. And they were smart enough to know that wasn't Franklin Roosevelt. It wasn't the Democratic Party. It was the unions, the socialists, and the communists. So they went to work. McCarthy got rid of the communists. Then the rest of them got rid of the socialists by telling Americans that socialist and communist is the same thing. They just spell it differently.
Right.
I discovered that as a young man when my students, my first class I ever taught was at Harvard. So my students could not distinguish communist, socialist, anarchist. They had no, these were all synonyms.
Yeah.
At first I said, oh, stupid. But they weren't stupid. They were perfectly smart young people. No one had ever clarified for them. In fact, their lives had been, these are all equivalently awful people and movements, and that's all you need to know. And that's all they did know. And that's part of the problem. They don't know what to do with socialism in Western Europe. When I tell them that the largest yesterday, I had to tell a group of about 200 that the largest bloc in the French National Assembly is the bloc of a man named Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's a Marxist who used to be a leader of the Communist Party. He's now sort of independent, but his politics are the same, and everyone in France knows it. And that's the biggest bloc. Not Mr. Macron, not Marine Le Pen, no, him. and his allies. What? And 250 left-wing activist young people had no idea of any of it.
Yeah, that's why it's so important to for us to not only look at history but also look around the world. So, not just we Americans, but people, whether they're in France or in India or in China or in Africa or here or in South America, to look at different examples, to look at history so we can not feel that sense of hopelessness and powerlessness that is so set in now. And so, what I want to ask you about next is, of course, our president, current president Trump, has sort of in a Great Gatsby kind of sense shouted out this Gilded Age era, right? This idea of land grabs, kind of early sort of imperialistic action and activity. And and an important note about the Gilded Age is it was a time when just very few people who are now we call robber barons controlled the means of production and exploited the technologies of those times, right? Those technologies, whether they were technologies of steel, technologies of railways, etc. Now we're sitting at a point where the technologies of our time, AI, algorithmic social media systems, big tech, gig economy, all of these things, all of which use our data. None of them would be worth anything without using our data, surveillance of our data without any transparency, are sort of in this new kind of Gilded Age moment where the means of production are in the hands of so few. Mr. Musk, who fortunately has left the government, has more wealth than over 50% of the American population. And it's like it's like a Pac-Man that's swooping everything up in that exists and just swallowing it all up. And so, my question for you is, how to sort of deal with that situation where an internet we all paid for, our data, which is ours, our lives are being turned into data, are being put into these systems and technologies that are organizing our lives and influencing our lives around such profound economic extraction. And so, reason I ask that is because we have seen at times in history worker actions, 76 death of Franco in Spain, South Korea's democratic struggle before the 88 Seoul Olympic Games. Now we're looking at Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a U.S. citizen who was a trade union organizer, has now been has been abducted through what even the government says is an error, and has been tossed in a crazy gangster maximum prison called Sicot in San Salvador or in El Salvador. So there are these examples of union organizing that you just alluded to, right? Coming out of the Gilded Age and out of the Depression and so on, that led to national actions that changed things so that we can imagine this world of data, this world of tech could benefit us all. So I wonder if any of those historical examples can be applicable today as we consider conditions for transformative labor power and economic power.
Yeah, I think they all can, as long as we would be open as a group to doing two things: to interrogate each of them for what were the common elements that we could extract so that we could teach them, but also can we develop, and this is what all theory does, can we develop an abstract rendition that can be applied to everything and that teaches as it is being used about the alternative that is otherwise invisible? So let me do one for you as an example. I do this in my classes, just so you know. I have a lot of practice with it. Um, Imagine a technological breakthrough that makes the workers in a factory or an office or a store twice as productive as they were before this new piece of equipment or software, whatever it is, was brought into play. What will the typical capitalist do once he becomes aware that there is this software or there is this machine or whatever it is? And the answer we know. The answer is he will say, wow, this could enhance my profit. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to buy that machine or that software, have it installed, and then tell half of my workers, don't come back Monday morning. This is your pink slip. You're done. Get lost. I don't know you from Adam. Because the remaining half can now use this new technology, produce twice as much as they used to. In other words, my output is the same. I will, to make the example simple, same price, so I'll get the same revenue selling the same number of outputs at the same price. And why is that good? Because I'm getting the same revenue, but half of my payroll I don't have anymore. They're gone. And that money I would have given them as a wage, I get to keep as an enhancement on my profit. My profit will go way up. And so I will install the machine and I will celebrate AI, if that's the one I'm using, because, and we'll see AI's impact on our society because and to the extent that it proved to be a profitable decision for employers to make. I let that sink in. Then I say to the students, now follow me. There is an alternative. They start perking up because none occurred to them. Here's the alternative. All of the workers, well, let's make it even better, I say. Let's suppose this is a different kind of enterprise. It has no employer, it just has employees. That the employees together as a group function as their own employer. Now, what would they do with this new technology, the new machine, the new software? Here's what they would do. It makes us twice as productive. Okay, we're not firing anybody. Everybody goes on half time. Everybody who used to work 8 hours is now going to work 4 hours. We're not going to cut their pay because we can pay them the same. In 4 hours, they will produce the same output, which we will sell at the same price, generating the same revenue. The profit of the enterprise will not have gone up, but it will not have gone down. It's exactly as before. But we will have delivered to the workers a one half time drop in their labor. They will realize a level of leisure, a level of time to spend with their family, with their hobbies, with their passions, with their political activities that they never dreamed of before, and will have the same output. That's an alternative. And let's compare them. In the first case, the technology improves the profit of the minority that are profit earners. In the second case, you have given leisure to the majority, not a minority. So the democratic way to go would be the second one. Okay, you know what this does? This teaches that the technology is only the beginning of a conversation. It's never the end. The
Right.
technology does not carry within it profitability. That is to that's to be a slave of this system. You got to teach people how to see and to value systemic analysis. And they either don't have any idea what you're talking about, or if they do, systems analysis has been used to teach them certain computer courses or certain biological courses, but to use it as an economic framework, no, they just they don't get it.
Yeah, and a big part of that, Dr. Wolff, is the just burying of what economists call externalities, right? So like it's just very narrow visions of economic optimization creates all sorts of hell and troubles, including for those who are trying to optimize that economic situation themselves, and that it's considered, peripheral to any sort of systemic thinking. And your comments remind me of John Maynard Keynes, who once said that advancing technologies would lead to a 15-hour work week, or even Bernie, said, attempted before the end of the Biden administration to introduce a 32-hour work week, which got laughed, off the stage. And there have always been visions of that are sort of future oriented, like even the Bauhaus, that said, hey, we can have a commercial economy, but we can also support care, and we can also support creativity, and those things don't have to be dictated by the rules of commercial transactionalism. So all of that is leading me to this question that my father, who's a professor at Stanford Business School, sometimes asks me. He's like, Ramesh, you think with your heart. I love Bernie too, but he'll bankrupt the economy. My father supported President Biden. He liked Bernie though, and he says, you're always talking about this social democracies, or even the word socialism. Tell me a single example of, and I know you've heard this a million times, of socialism that's actually worked. Give me one example of that ever having worked. And then there's the conflation of that with communism, right? Like, give me an example of communism that actually works. So, these are dirty words, partly because no one knows what these things mean in the American lexicon. But I think also we need to see examples, whether they're, global or other countries or other regions or whatever, where we see a certain kind of socialist project, a project that actually, where the economy supports the self, but also supports the wider society, which then can support the self. We need to see examples of that. So, my father's question to you, Dr. Wolff, what are examples we can look at, past, present, around of a more socialist approach that supports all in action? Because that word socialism is a scary word still, because of the the indoctrination and manipulation that we've seen.
I will. I'll be glad to give you examples. There are so many that it would take hours for me to do this properly.
There we go.
There's no problem. You'll see that in a minute. But tell your father, or the figurative role played by your father, that it's a little bit of a syllogism to deny people information about all the examples, and then to challenge people by saying, give me an example. Well, I mean, it's like saying to a young person, give me an example of high mountains. Well, they've never been to any. But you haven't proven anything about high mountains by the fact that someone whom you've denied access to the mountain can't tell you about, Mount Kilimanjaro, which is in Kenya and which is a big mountain, blah, 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 because you haven't let them know what it is. So we live in a culture in which socialism is mostly ignored. Secondly, ridiculed and despised, and finally misrepresented. So if you ask people, give me an example of a successful socialism, where would they get one from? There's no place that does that. So let me do a few of them. Let me start with China. China refers to itself as socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's the phrase, the official phrase. So they call themselves socialist. There is no agency in the world, there never was, that certifies you are or are not a socialist. That is something you decide one day, and you say, hello, I'm a socialist. Bingo, you are one, right? So I'm not really interested in people who say, well, it's not really socialist. There is no really socialist. You just made that up. And you can't tell me of any place that ever was that qualified and was accepted anywhere in the world as the official determinant of what is or isn't socialism. So you're stuck with a multiplicity of definitions, and nothing you say makes all that go away. All right, so China has every right to call itself socialism. What is it that makes it a successful, or for that matter, unsuccessful example? Well, let's see. At the time it became socialist, 1949, China was one of the poorest countries on the face of the earth. It was a country about whom a novel had been written by an American missionary named Pearl Buck called The Good Earth. And if you ever want to have a book that gives you an image of poverty, read that book. You'll never forget it. I never have. I read it when I was in college. Okay, so the number one objective of everybody in China at that time, with maybe 9 exceptions, was to stop being the poorest country in the world and to develop a modern standard of living. Diet, clothing, housing, transportation, education, healthcare, all of that. None of which they had, all of which they wanted. Okay. Over the last 75 years, the Chinese, with their uniquely socialist economy, have done what they set out to do more and better than any other country. No one is even close. So, if you want an example of success, there it is, screaming at you. Here we are. And not only that, we are we used to be the biggest country in the world. That's now India, but not by a lot. The 1.3 or 1.4 billion, whatever the exact number is. They did it with a huge population, isolated from the rest of the world, hounded by the West. What did they pull off? Holy what do you want for success? That ought to shut the conversation down. Bingo, bango. What are you talking about? All right, let me now shift. I'm going to take France and Germany. Those countries have been called socialist, or sometimes a variation on the term social democrat or democratic social. Okay, those are fudgy terms. We can talk about that, but they are in the broad family of socialism. Before, for instance, in Germany, it used to be called Scandinavian socialism, as in Denmark or Norway or Sweden and so forth. Okay, what does that involve? Gee, that's different from China because there's very little governmental ownership and operation of enterprise. In China, about 50% of the country is private capitalist and 50% is government owned and operated. Scandinavia was never like that. France and Germany are not like. They're overwhelmingly private, but the government regulates and controls so as to, example, have much less of an inequality of wealth and income than you have in the United States, right? In those countries, everybody gets health insurance. I have taught in France. I've been a part of their health insurance, and I can tell you it works very well. Does it have problems? You bet. Are there fuck ups? You bet. But is it a good system? You bet. And any French politician who ever mentioned taking it away would see their vote disappear overnight. It's not, you can't even do what the conservatives in England could do to the National Health Service there. You cannot do that in Germany, and you cannot do that in France. Okay? Higher education there is free, not like here, right? And I could go on. They have I think that's successful. I think the level of literacy of their people, the level of education, the level of political participation. I mean, we don't have a yellow vest movement. They do. We don't have people engaged in a dozen political parties, which are important in their different. We don't have that, right? So, what's a success? All right, now let me give you another one. In the north of Spain, is in the city of Mondragon in the north of Spain is a corporation called
Mm-hmm.
the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. Was formed in 1956 by a Catholic priest in that village. Spain is a Catholic country. And it has grown to the point to where today it has 130,000 participants. It is the seventh largest corporation in Spain. Now, right there, before I even go on, that's a record of growth that would be the envy of any capitalist corporation. 6 workers started it in 1956. It has 120, 130,000 today. It's a wow. Through all the ups and downs of the last 75 years of capitalism, this company has grown. It maintains its own university, Mondragon. I've taught there, I've been there. It has its own bank. It has its own research laboratories where 2 American corporations have paid them in recent years to have their scientists work alongside the Mondragon. And those 2 corporations are Microsoft and General Motors. Not bad. These are worker co ops. That's what they've been since 1956. In them, the workers are their own employers. There are no employers separate from the workers. The workers collectively hire themselves as individuals. Wow. And they have a rule. Here's an interesting rule: the best paid cannot get more than, last time I looked, 8.5 times what the lowest paid worker gets. In a modern American corporation, the CEO relative to the lowest paid is in the neighborhood of 350 to 1, not 8.5 to 1. Wow. You know what that means? That they have a level of equality that no capitalist country comes close to. Isn't that a success? What the hell is this all about? And I could go on, you know, and I don't want to be disrespectful to your father, whom I've never met, and have no animosity toward whatsoever. But he is repeating, whether he's aware of it or not, he is repeating, as you yourself said, what a lot of people say. You're absolutely right. I hear it all the time. And as I say to them, as I said to you, give me as much time as you want. I will fill it up with one example after the other. What are you doing? Why would you even go down that road? Because what it does is it exposes, not that there's a lack of examples, but it exposes that you don't know of any of them. And that ought to embarrass you. It really ought to. Before you're so quick to say there isn't one there, why don't you ask the question? Might there be one that I don't know about? The minute you ask that question, you're smart, you'll know the answer. Of course, there might be one you don't know about.
And Dr. Wolff, having lived myself in Bolivia, I saw a quite poor country that had many, we could call them socialist reforms that led to the eradication of illiteracy and the lowering of poverty. I spent time in Brazil. We can see with Lula's leadership a different kind of version. It's that what we call socialism or being pro-social can take on many different faces based on the place, history, culture, and so on, and that socialism is not the enemy of business. Socialism is not the enemy of technology. It's just a way in which we can lift all boats up.
Yeah, and it's a different way of organizing an enterprise. It's a different way of understanding the relationship between an enterprise and the political system, or an enterprise and the community that surrounds the enterprise, where the workers live. Oh, come on, don't be narrow in your brain. The world is not only the way you've experienced it, right? You are aware that once upon a time there was, for example, slavery. It doesn't exist anymore, but there used to be a time when the people were divided between the masters and the slaves. And you're aware of that. You really are. And you're aware it was very different. And you're kind of grateful, I hope, that you don't live in a society which plugs you in. Either you're a slave or you're a master. Either you're a serf or you're a lord. Here we go now. Either you're an employer or you're an employer. Where does this come from? We
Mm.
got rid of the slave and master. We got rid of the serf and lord. And guess what? I'm representing the people who want to get rid of the employee and the employer, and for mostly the same reasons. For most people, this is new. But it can be for many, particularly young people, very heady. It's a newness that they love because it opens the range of options in a way that they had been experiencing closing in on them.
Yeah, and I've even seen, I'll just add, I've also lived in South Africa in 2022, and I also, before that, had spent quite a bit of time in Kenya. There are numerous cooperatives you see all over the place, including ones that make profit still, but the profits are shared with workers
And
and
if I had the time, I would give you a history lecture about the dairy farms in Wisconsin and Minnesota who have for generations operated worker co-ops where they do not allow one person to be the employer. Not at all. And that's the way they want to do it. That's how they've made money. Many of them, I mean, it's just the notion that there is no example of a non-capitalist or non-hierarchical. I mean, there is something in America, you may know it, called the United States Federation of Worker Co-ops. They have their own website and all the rest, and they coordinate among the hundreds of worker co-ops in the United States who have this association to promote their growth. And if you want examples, there they are, hundreds of them. Right, you can find out about them. Take you a little bit of time on the internet and the Google search engine, and you'll be done.
and we can conceive of this digital world also following those same sorts of possibilities of lifting us all up.
There already are. We deal with a variety of internet engineer types who didn't want to have a hierarchy. They wanted a situation where everybody dressed in their Bermuda shirt, their Bermuda shorts, their Hawaiian shirt, with their frisbee, their puppy, and their 2-year-old, and they wanted to be able to bring their laptop to somebody's garage, and there, together with 20 other people, each of whom had done the same, work out what they were going to do as an enterprise.
Mm.
And nobody was the boss. They would Monday through Thursday, they worked on their projects. Friday, they met all day long and to discuss what projects do we undertake? Which ones do we not undertake? Which ones do we do in this order or that order? What about the division of labor? Are you Come on. The internet has spawned that, lots of that all over the place.
Mm.
Then I could go further, and this sometimes helps people. I tell them about something called the Marcora law in Italy.
Mm.
Okay, what is that? Named after the legislator, a Mr. Marcora, who got this passed. 1985, it was passed in the Italian parliament. The business community has tried to get rid of it, has not succeeded, still on the books in Italy now. It works like this. If you become unemployed in Italy, you have a choice. You can get a weekly dole, a payout, the way we do here in America. You're unemployed, you fill out the forms, you go wait online, and you get a check every week for some period of time. Okay? But in Italy, there's option B. You don't have to do that. Here's option B. If you can get at least 9 other unemployed men or women to join with you, the government will give you as a lump sum the total amount of payments that all 10 of you were entitled to.
Mm-hmm.
On one condition, you must use that startup money to organize a worker co-op. That's one of the reasons Italy has more worker co-ops than I mean. There's no mystery here. Create the opportunity, people will do it. Lots of people would much rather build a new business than go every week and collect a dole, which doesn't make you feel real good, which damages your self-esteem in a way that building an enterprise with 10 other people or 9 other people at least might do. Come on, create the institutions. You'll see We have all the evidence. And by the way, in the Mondragon University I mentioned before, they
Yeah.
teach courses how to start a worker co-op, how to finance a worker co-op, how to deal with the interpersonal tensions that arise in a co-op form of enterprise. You know, we're not inventing the wheel here. That's been done already. We just have to commit to it ideologically and politically. And by the way, they offer classes. They will welcome you. They do. They bring people to that part of Spain and they have very modern classrooms with all the bells and whistles and technology you need to learn and good teachers. No problem. It's all there. But the people who ask you or challenge you about, give me an example, uh, what they're telling you, which you
Right.
need to tell them gently, is that the problem isn't with the examples. The problem is you don't know anything about them. That's the problem. Yeah.
Yeah, and what our conversation today has brought is so much fresh air where you're reminding us we can look around, we can look to the past, we can look right underneath our noses, we could
Yeah.
look to Wisconsin, we could look at pretty much anywhere,
Over. That's
and we
right.
can see alternative possibilities. So I truly hope this is the first of many conversations, Dr. Wolff. I want to be respectful of your time. I'm excited to keep building with you.
Good.
It was awesome to talk with you today, and I just want to say thank you for joining Utopias. If there's anything you would like to leave us with, please do, and we will definitely be in touch soon.
If I could say a word, I was much affected as a young person reading a pamphlet written in the middle of the 19th century by Marx and Engels called Utopian Socialism, Utopian versus Scientific. And I understood it differently from the way my teacher at the time, who showed it to me, understood it. He understood it to be a claim that somehow the scientific is the way to go and the utopian is the way to leave behind. I did not read it that way. I just didn't. I understood what he meant by the critique of certain utopian socialists, Saint Simon, Fourier, Cabet, those people. But I always thought that a utopia is part of what other people call a dream that is a dream about what's possible but not yet achieved, a dream about what's possible as a goal to have in mind. You can't do things in the present if you don't have some idea of where you're trying to go. And that where is a utopia. And once I understood it, I realized that my utopia as a Marxist is just a different thing from the utopian of my neoclassical economic colleagues. They're lovely stories about a free market with efficiency and a unique equilibrium. What the hell are you talking? That's a utopia. That doesn't exist anywhere. So-called free market has never been realized. It's a utopian dream that governs where they want society to go. I don't. I have a different utopia. And there's nothing about that that should be hesitated around or should be ashamed. Not at all. You need a utopia. We need to paint beautiful pictures of where we're trying to go. And if we don't, we'll have a harder time getting there.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today,
My
Dr. Wolff.
pleasure too. Look forward to talking with you again.
That absolutely will happen.
Take
You have
care.
a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Your support means the world to us. Our podcast is really focused on creativity, on care, on stories of inspiration, and inspiring characters of all kinds. It's such a wonderful, wonderful way to reach community. This is a labor of love. So the real way we can sustain ourselves is through all of your support. Please rate, ideally 5 stars.
Please share this with anyone and everyone you know, and feel free to reach out to us also with suggestions on guests. Reach us at podcastutopias@gmail.com. Thank you, everybody, for your support.